LWCAD LITE Fences and Columns. In this video, I'll show you how easily you can add fence and column objects into LWCAD library. Then I'll show you how to set some additional parameters for these objects, such as intervals, how to set ground, how to set custom fence axis, and how to set pattern and start end parameters. First, I'll show you how to add fence or column object into LWCAD library. I'll show you this process in all three platforms, 3D Studio Max, Cinema and Lightwave, so you can see this process of adding into library is identical in all three platforms. In 3D Studio Max, you need to select object or objects which you are going to add into library. Then be sure this is editable mesh. If it is not, then convert it into editable mesh. Then you need to activate Add to Library tool from LWCAD tab. Then you need to set proper library type where you are going to add this object. So in this case it will be fence library type. And then you need to choose base viewport for this object. In case of fences and columns, it will be this top viewport because we want to store fences and columns from the side of this object, how it is used on the fence. So I will click into top viewport. Now tool is activated and we can set additional properties, but in this case we will leave it as a default, and you can save it into library. I will create a new directory temp and store this fence into it as a with save shape button. I'll save it as a fence max. In Cinema, process is identical. First you need to select object which you are going to add, then be sure this is a polygonal object. Then activate Add to Library tool. In this tool you need to set proper library type, so fence library type. Then you need to click into top viewport and you can save this object into library. So I will use same temp folder and use save shape button. Fence Cinema 4D. In Lightwave you don't need to select the object because if nothing is selected, all is selected. Use Add to Archviz, which is identical with Add to Library tool. In the numeric panel, choose library type to fence, click into top viewport, tool is activating and you can save into library. I will use same temporary folder and we will save this object with Add Shape button, which is identical with Save Shape button. And you can see in these thumbnails all three objects are stored in temporary folder and all these objects are identical, saved in different ports of LWCAD. Intervals. Intervals are additional parameters which you can set for fence or column objects when you are storing them into library. And with intervals you can set ranges of object along X, Y and Z axis which will be frozen or fixed. So when these objects will be later used and stretched, those interval ranges will be always same dimension. Let's try intervals on two different examples. First, this fence tool. I will use Add to Library fence library, this fence, and we will set the intervals with open job buttons intervals, and along x-axis I will set frozen interval here along this plank and two intervals along y-axis, the bottom part and top part. And we will save this into temporary as a fence intervals. As a second example, we'll use this column object and we will add it into library into column library with the interval along y-axis, and we will fix only this top part of the column. And we'll store it into temp directory. Column intervals. When using fence tool with these two objects, fence and column library object, you can see in this case it is column without intervals, fence without intervals. When I'm scaling the fence along x-axis, you can see here in perspective viewport that the plank is scaled when you draw the fence. And when you change the height of the fence, you can see there is always the scale, full scale. Same for the column. You can see column is scaled and the top part is deformed. Now we will use the interval version of both objects, and on column you can see when we change height of the column, the top part is always frozen with interval. Same for the fence. Top and bottom part is frozen, only middle is stretching, and same along x-axis. Now the planks are always same dimension, only the spaces between planks are scaling. Set ground. Set ground is additional parameter, this OpenGL button here, which you can set the ground level for this object. So by default, ground is sitting on the bottom of the object, and if you change it with set ground parameter, then you can customize this offset from the ground, object offset from the ground. Example of use fence tool with fence with default ground, and this is customized ground with offset, so you can see the difference. Fence axis is next optional parameter for library objects. For this fence object, we need to set fence axis from the top of the object. So if this object is sitting in top viewport, we are setting it in back viewport. So we need to see the object from the top. So when you set fence axis, by default fence axis is in the middle of the object, and you can set it, let's say, to the left side of the object or right side of the object, or any offset from the object. And this fence axis is in fact the tool line, fence tool line. Let's try fence tool without columns, so we can see fence axis here. So this is fence which was stored with default fence axis, and here is the version which has fence axis on the left side. So the object is on the right side, and this is left version, so left side. Pattern and start and parameter. These two additional options you can set for fence and column objects are a little bit more complicated. So first I'll try to explain what these parameters are doing, and then we'll do some examples. Start and parameter defines beginning and end of the fence object or column object along x-axis, along the direction where you go with fence. Pattern defines a range where the fence object is repeated. So let's try to put these parameters. I'll start with this simple fence object, and we add this into fence library, and by default both ranges are on the beginning and end of the object. So these white half lines to the top are defining the beginning and end, and red lines defines the pattern. Let's try to change pattern of this first case. So I will move the pattern more closer and leave the start end on the beginning and end. Now we try to use both versions with a fence tool. So without column, this is the first version with default pattern. Pattern is from the beginning to the end of the fence object, and you can see it is repeated. Full scale of the object is repeated. There is no overlap on the beginning and end. If we use customized pattern, here pattern is smaller. It is inside of the object, and you can see it starts with normal fence object as it was stored, but here repeated is only inner part, and on the end you can see again it is ending with full object. Let's try second example. Adding to fence library. Now we'll change pattern only to fit this flank, so there will be no gaps. There will be only beginning part, then repeated flank and end part of the fence. Let's save this. Second example with default pattern, which is identical in start end range, and customized pattern where you can see beginning end part of the fence and customized pattern only within range of the flank. In third example, I'll show you how useful can be set custom start end for columns. So in this case, we add this object into column library, and you can see start and end of this column is beginning on this edge because top part is a little bit bigger, but we don't want to continue with this column, so fence should be attached to this part, not default start end position. So we need to change it with start end on the place where we want to continue with a fence part. So when we use both versions of columns with a fence tool, you can see here default version of column. There is of course gap because there was a gap on the beginning and end of the column. And when we use our customized column but with custom start end, there is no gap, and the final object is as we need it.